Hello everyone and welcome to tonight's episode of Beginner Breakdown. My name as always is Alex and I'm excited to be showing you this lesson. We're going to be talking about Autopilot. So this is something that's happened to me over the years, especially when I was younger and kind of starting out in play. At first, as a beginner, you're kind of learning the moves and you're learning the principles and you're really just kind of reacting and responding to everything. But after you get a little bit better and you start to, make some patterns, maybe you play the London defense and you kind of just get into a habit of doing kind of the same thing every time. Or like me, you play the King's Indian defense. And you kind of get into this habit of just following this same pattern of opening moves over and over again. The problem is sometimes your opponents respond in ways that can cause you some issues. So we're going to talk about that by looking at two games tonight that both feature the King's Indian, mostly just because I play it, and so I'm very familiar with it. But I think both of these games, one of them I win, one of them I lose, and they both show both players, in some cases, using Autopilot instead of actually assessing the positions. So that's our topic for tonight. To start out, for those unfamiliar, we always want to think about openings in line with opening principles. So I think understanding moves and move orders is important to an extent, but it's way more important to understand your moves and figure out how they are fitting with the grander scheme of the game. So your three opening principles are you want to control the center, specifically these four squares. It's a great launching point for you to attack your opponent's king, as well as defend your own, and putting your pieces there, either attacking these squares or on them, is generally a really good idea. Second, we need to develop our pieces, right? We need to get our pieces into the game. So knights and bishops want to come out, find good squares to go to. Your rooks and queens do as well to an extent, but they usually want to wait a little bit because they're pretty big targets if they get out too early. Third thing is you want to protect your king. So we need to get our king safe in some form or other. Usually we're going to do it by castling one side or the other. And there's sometimes situations where you don't need to, but usually that's what it means to get your king safe. So with those three principles in mind, let's start by looking at the particular opening that features in both of these games. I'm going to kind of go through it along line with these principles, but also lay out some of the basic plans so that especially people who are unfamiliar will at least have an idea of what each player is shooting for as we look at the openings and try and find where Autopilot is creating some weaknesses. So the variation that is played in the King's Indian defense that we're going to look at starts with d4. This is the main start, right? Normal opening move, controlling the center, opening up space for the bishop. Kind of just a traditional classic move, right? Maybe less popular at normal levels than e4, but still a fairly popular and very, very good solid move nonetheless. And now black continues knight to f6. So there's a few defenses this could move into, but by moving the knight, rather than like a more classical defense, like playing d5 right away, this is already showing that we are trying to play a little more flexibly, but also a little less traditionally, right? Normally, the traditional theory of chess says we're going to fight for the center immediately with the pawns and kind of stake a claim in the center. With knight f6, we're going to be a little more responsive. So we're going to wait and see how our opponent chooses to set up their pieces. There's a lot of different things they can do. And the line we're going to look at is c4. This is kind of the main way to continue. Because knight to f6 is preventing pawn to e5, right? If they played that, you would just take it for free. Usually white's going to want to keep fighting for the center. They could play a move like knight to c3 to immediately push this pawn. But the problem here is this is blocking in their pawn on c2. So why not play c4 first? You can always play knight to c3 later and then play e4 and kind of get the best of both worlds. So that's kind of the school of thought with this move here. Black continues with g6. Again, there's different move things they can do. You could play d6 or some other options. If you'd played e6 here, it'd be maybe a Nimzo Indian defense. But we're looking at the King's Indian. And the main idea here is we are preparing to fianchetto our bishop here on g7. Look at the nice long diagonal, and then get our king castled in this kind of secure structure. So something to note about the King's Indian, and really all defenses where you are fianchettoing a bishop and then castling, is this bishop is very important, especially as a defensive resource, right? Notice how after we push this pawn, the pawns are really only controlling the light squares. There's a lot of dark squared weaknesses. So we need to keep this bishop alive in order to, defend all of that and kind of fix it. But it is also an attacking piece on this diagonal. So that's kind of what is happening with this move here. Knight to c3, very normal move, right? Now getting the knight in play, preparing to play e4, now that the pawn has pushed forward. So white is just hoping to continue taking up space in the center. And bishop g7. Now we are committed to the King's Indian defense. You could have played something like a Grunfeld if you played d5, another very traditional opening, but bishop g7 does signify we are playing the King's Indian defense. And e4, the main move, the most testing move. White is taking up full space in the center, really relishing the fact that we have not pushed any of our pawns to fight them. And what's happening here is, I know I said one of the opening principles is you want to control the center, right? And it looks like white's doing an excellent job of that and black is not. Well, that's true, and if we continue to play this way and castle our king and just, maybe play pawns over here and never really fight in the center, we're going to get blown off the board. You do need to fight back. But this opening is it's called the hyper-modern school of chess openings, and the thought process here is we're going to let our opponent pick some kind of setup. In this case, it's this version of the King's Indian. And then based on what they do, we're going to respond and try and undermine their setup, or maybe if they've overextended, capitalize on those weaknesses. So, e4, now we definitely can't play d5, right? This is off the table. That's why if you want to play the Grunfeld, you'd need to play it first, because now there's too many things defending this square. d6. The point of this move is twofold. One, we're preparing to open up our bishop, and also we are making e5 less good for white. In some lines, if we don't have d6, they can just push to e5 and make our knight move away, cause some annoying problems. With d6, that's not as good, because we are going to be able to trade things and open up the center and weaken kind of this beautiful center that white is trying to hold on to. And now we're going to look at a very specific line, right? White has a lot of options here. The main one is probably to play knight to f3, but there's really hundreds of ways you can play this. You can play the 4 knights, you could bring the bishop out to g5 or f4 or e3, really anywhere with this bishop. Put the bishop on e2 and maybe set up for some kind of, this is sometimes called the bayonet attack, where you're going to kind of launch with this pawn and the bishop and queen are going to defend it. There's really a lot of things white can do. But the two games we're going to look at both feature this move, pawn to f3. And this is known as the Saemisch variation. And it's a solid move that is really defending the center. And it's also kind of fighting against some of the main ideas of the King's Indian. So before we get into the specifics of this variation, I want to very briefly talk about what kind of the main line looks like and what are normally the plans, because that's going to help understand this idea of autopiloting. So normally what's going to happen is this kind of classical setup. White is going to develop their pieces, and black is going to continue the plan, castling, bishop e2, e5, right? It's important at some point to strike in the center. Sometimes c5 is the way that people play it, but I like e5 more. Castles, and just something like this, knight to c6, d5, knight e7, b4, and we're going to start to see really the plans for both sides here. We're going to stop at this position, but this gives a good example. Often in the King's Indian defense, and especially in these main lines, what's going to happen is white is fighting on the queen side, right? White is going to try and storm over here on the queen side, break through, and get their pieces involved over here. Whereas black is fighting on the king side. So black is going to launch forward these pawns, especially with this move we just saw of f5, and try and push the pawns farther forward to strike at the king on the king side. And often what happens in these games is the side that wins is the side that gets their plan through first, or better. So that's normally what's happening in the King's Indian defense. And I wanted to talk about that because in the Saemisch, the ideas are now a little different. With f3, you can still continue as white with these plans, right? You can use f3 as a supportive move, just holding on to the center a little bit better, and continue eventually with these ideas of striking out at the queen side. But there's also this interesting option now, where white can instead choose to launch these pawns, right? f3 is a great supportive piece for not only e4, but also g4. And so there are some real ideas of pushing forward with h4, h5, and this can cause problems. So in these variations, white often is fighting on the king side, and black's going to have to fight on the queen side, where normally it's the other way around. So keep that in mind, because that's going to show up. In the variations, we're going to look at black castles, and white plays bishop to e3, which not only defends this d4 pawn, but has kind of another idea. Queen d2 is often coming, followed by queenside castles, and this bishop and queen are going to look at this diagonal. So for instance, something like e5, queen d2, I guess you can take here, so maybe queen d2 wouldn't be so good there, but, you know, something like this. Instead, the move that I play, instead of something like e5, I play this move knight a6, and it's pretty weird. It's a pet line of mine that I kind of like, but it's actually, I think, much more effective against the main line than it is against the Saemisch. And we're going to talk about why as we see what's going on in these games. So, kind of the point here is it looks weird to put this knight on the edge, but often the knight wants to jump in either to b4 and cause some problems over here, or to c5, or even sometimes to c7 once this pawn has moved. So that's kind of the idea. So one example line might be something like queen d2, e5, striking at the center, d5, pushing past, locking things up, and knight to c5. And this is what we're going to look at in both of the games that happened tonight. Black has centralized the knight, white has locked down the center and has this really nice pawn chain, and there's really pros and cons for both players. A few quick alternatives. I don't want to get too lost in the opening without talking about the main theme, but there's some other options here instead of knight a6. But after knight a6 has been played, and queen d2 again serving to help the king castle, and also eventually threatening to play this bishop to h6 move. Why would white want to do this? Well, this battery is really helpful because, as we said, this dark squared bishop plays a very important role of defending these dark squares, right? The pawns now are defending the light squares. The bishop needs to defend the dark squares. So if white can remove both of these bishops, they're going to do a great service to themselves, right? They're going to make black's castle a lot weaker. e5. Sometimes c5 does happen here. This is actually, I think, more common in the knight a6 line, with the idea of now bringing the knight back to c7, and sometimes forwards to b4. And if the pawn takes, then the knight is either right now or eventually ready to occupy this c5 square. If white were to trade, this would all be very happy for black. One, their bishop is no longer able to trade for ours, and we've also opened up these lines, broken away white center, so this would be something very, very happy for black. But e5, and there's a lot of options here, and my opponent has always chosen d5 in both of these games. They could castle here and allow takes, they could defend the pawn, but again, without getting too bogged down in opening theory, we're going to look at what actually has happened in these two games. And so this is going to be our starting position. So keep this one in mind and kind of how we got here. I'm going to breeze through it a little bit in the next two games, but I want to give some backstory for these two games. So both of these games were played between me, I had the black pieces, and my opponent was Mike Kummer, who you may recognize from several of the videos on our channel. He's done Beginner Breakdown in the past, but a lot of other things as well. Really awesome part of our community here at the Chess Club. And he's played me in this position exactly twice. The first one happened in late 2020. I want to say it was November. And this game, I actually ended up winning. But let's see what happens. So we, again, enter this position, and all of the ideas I just spoke of are what's going on here. Okay. And in this first variation, this first game, Mike deviates by playing the move bishop to h6, which, as we spoke of, is a very normal idea here. White would love to exchange these bishops and weaken my king side. Often, usually, this will be accompanied by moves like g4 and h5 and trying to storm the castle. So notice how, unlike the regular King's Indian defense, the kind of more traditional variations, White is the one fighting on the king side, not black. So this is not usual for this type of opening, although it is usual for the Saemisch variation. But I was still kind of getting more familiar with the King's Indian defense at this point, and so the move I played was a5. And in standard lines of the King's Indian, this is actually a lot better. This move makes more sense. What's the point? The point of a5 is sometimes to play to a4, sometimes to stay on a5 and guard b4, but regardless, the point is to slow down White's assault on the queen side. This is not so much an aggressive attacking move. In some cases it can be, but this is more meant to kind of slow down these pawns advancing, fighting through on the queen side, and causing me some problems here as black. But we're already witnessing my opponent, while he hasn't committed to it yet, he is, trying to trade off these bishops, and it's very likely that he's going to storm the castle with the pawns, which means I don't need to be slowing him down on the queen side. This isn't really gaining me anything. Instead, I need to be worried about what's happening on the king side. So maybe a5, not the best move here. It's definitely showing signs of me autopiloting this defense instead of actually responding to what my opponent is doing with this Saemisch variation. And I want to briefly stop in this position because instead of a5, I already have a much better move. There's a really beautiful tactical idea that white can play, that black can play in this position that kind of shows one of the potential benefits of this strange kind of knight a6 to c5 maneuver that we've experienced. So I want to see if anyone can find a nice move for black in this variation to gain a really almost decisive advantage already. So take a second. If you're watching this later, you can pause. If you're watching on YouTube or something, you can pause this and try and figure it out. But there's a really nice idea, and it looks like someone in the chat has already found it. Luca6768, well done. Yeah, knight takes e4. Beautiful move, bam. And you didn't specify, but it's important you take with this knight on f6. And it looks like we're sacrificing a piece here. But there's kind of a trick. We are threatening the queen, so you have to respond. If you take with the knight, I'll take back with mine. And if you take with the pawn, then it's going to be the same. Either way, my goal now is to shoot for this beautiful move, queen to h4 check, kind of punishing the fact that white has played f3. Right? Normally, in variations, f3 is not actually a recommended move. In the Saemisch, it's fine, but you have to be careful with it, because it does expose this diagonal. And the knight from f taking is very important because it opens up this discovered attack from the queen. This queen is now going to be able to go here. And there's no time to trade off this bishop because your queen is hanging. If you take with the knight, I'll take back, and the same thing is happening. You have to take, and I'm going to get this either way. And the problem here for white is, let's say a move like g3, and queen takes bishop. Despite only being a pawn up, right? If you look at everything on the position, I'm only up this f pawn, right? Black hasn't lost any pawns, white's lost this one. And despite that, the computer gives this almost minus 6, but 6 points in black's favor, meaning we're almost better than, we could just have a rook and it wouldn't be as good as this position. So why is that? Why is this so good for black? Well, I think it's because so much of the pressure that white was trying to put on has diffused. Without this f-pawn, there's really no more ideas of stretching forward with h4 and g4. These are going to be too slow and too unsafe. We're going to have enough coverage over here to deal with it. Also, our ideas of pressing forward in the center are going to continue just as well. So f5 is coming very soon, and our pieces are going to get activated. Whether or not queens are traded, White's king is just kind of out in the open. Queenside castling isn't going to help that much, and our pieces are just so much better developed, right? We have our king is castled, our bishop is nicely placed on g7. This bishop can come out anytime soon, even maybe over here to help fight on the queen side. And yeah, white is just not doing very well here. So I already missed that nice little tactical shot. And then some of that goes to show for me autopiloting as well, just like my opponent. But both of us could have been punished a little better than what happens in the game. So what does happen is I play a5, my opponent trades bishops, king takes, and now h4. And this is another good move. I think this is less autopilot and more just maybe a slight positional inaccuracy, because strategically there's a problem with this h4 move, and it's that it's allowing me to block with something on h5. Now in the game, I played pawn to h5, which seems like a very sensible move. My pawn is attacking g4 with my knight, and it's going to make it harder for white to punish this. It's especially harder for white to charge forward with g4. So perhaps it's a little better to start with the move g4. This way, now h5, you're just going to take it, and you're going to be quite happy opening up this file to attack my king later on. So this is going to limit my options a little bit. But yeah, h4, and I play h5, and it's actually better to play the knight to h5. In my mind, I thought this doesn't solve the problem, because I thought they were just going to play pawn to g4, and now this knight just has to retreat and looks kind of silly. But actually in this position, knight to g3 is a very solid move, forking the rook and bishop, and the problem, I was like, okay, well, this piece is worth the same as this, and my knights had to move around and be developed, so why is it so good? Well, the problem is, if you want to save your rook, you're going to have to move it. And when I take this bishop, you have to take with the king, which means you can't castle anymore. So your king is going to be kind of committed to this side of the board, which means if you really want to press forward with these plans, it's going to be a double-edged sword. Your king's going to be just as open as mine. And this is not so good for white. So knight h5, actually a very strong move, also stopping g4. It's actually threatening to play knight g3 right now, even if you don't play g4. So you have to find something creative to get around this piece. But back to our game, h5. And here my opponent plays bishop d3, perhaps another bit of a strategic mistake. It's not really clear what this bishop is doing. Since it's sitting right behind these two pawns on e4 and c5, and it doesn't look like either of them are going to be traded anytime soon, this bishop is really just a tall pawn. Not the best. You would rather have this piece working on a long diagonal where it can actually do something. So I think maybe on e2 it might be a little better, where it's actually supporting the f3 pawn and supporting through it the g4 square, trying to fight against my knight and pawn. But bishop to d3. And I played the move c6, which is a very important move, happens a lot in variations of the King's Indian defense. And the idea here is, one, I'm threatening to fight in the center, and anytime I can break open the center, it's always going to be in my advantage. One, because my opponent hasn't castled, and two, because the whole point of the opening is I'm letting my opponent overextend in the center and choosing to prioritize development. So if I can break through my opponent's pride and joy here in this beautiful pawn chain, then it's going to be a good idea. This is also, with c6, I'm also opening up this diagonal for the queen here to maybe get involved and fight on the queen side, which could be relevant in some positions, especially if my opponent decides to queenside castle. Okay, knight to h3. And this move, I understand it, because my opponent wants to involve the knight in the attack. Right, this knight, if it just goes to e2, maybe it's not really as involved. It's going to take a little while. I have control of the f4 square, so it's not going to be able to jump there. And you probably don't want to push the pawn to f4 since you spent a move pushing it to f3, and you're still fighting for g4. So I understand why he doesn't want to play this, but I do think this would be better served for the knight. Maybe just getting the knight on e2, castling, and then bringing your other rook over to support g4 would probably be a better way to continue. But his idea is probably to get this knight into g5 and maybe put some pressure on f7 and potentially even e6, just depending on how things go. However, this actually gave me a nice opportunity, and so I played the move c takes d5. And I think that this is actually a very nice move that I found. I don't think, it's been a few years, right? I played this game in 2020, so I don't remember exactly my thought process here, but I do know that I found it's actually a really nice move, because no matter how white recaptures here, I think black is very, very happy. Perhaps the most challenging is to take with the c pawn. My opponent chose to take with the knight, but we're going to look at all three options. So if c takes d5, Again, the best way to recapture, I think probably the best, most forcing continuation here would have been starting with knight takes d3 check. And now a really, really pretty move, b5, which looks very unusual. You'll see this in some Benoni type structures where you're sacrificing this pawn, although usually I think that's on b6, not b5. But the point is the same. We're actually happy to give up this pawn, and either way they take this piece, it's not going to be worth it. For example, if queen takes b5, then something like bishop to a6. We are preventing white from kingside castling, so we're cutting off that option. And wherever white goes, let's say something like queen to c6, we can continue by making threats on the queen side here. And now white can't castle kingside, white probably shouldn't castle queenside, so whatever white's doing, the king is going to be in trouble. Opening up, sacrificing this pawn to open up these files is well worth it with our opponent's king not safe. If they take with the knight instead, then the same idea, you can play bishop a6. Now the knight's pinned, and there's actually no good ways to stop this, right? Very natural move a4 to defend. We can attack it again and still stop white from kingside castling, so kind of keeping the king, Benko, yes, I said Benoni, but Benko, thank you, Luca. Keeping the king locked here in the center. Once again, you can choose to queenside castle, but are you really going to put your king on this open file? That looks really nice. So something maybe like knight f to d2 to allow the king to castle again. Knight d7, castle, knight c5. Jumping in, hitting the queen. And there's just a lot of problems here. If something very simple like queen to e3, then we're just happy to win this pawn and continue winning on the queen side. But there's a really kind of nice tactical idea. If they play queen to e2, trying to hold on to this pawn, then black has a really nice tactical shot to gain a pretty serious advantage again in this position. So what would you do if you have the black pieces here? Once again, feel free to pause if you're watching this on a recording, but if you're here live, take a second, see if you can figure it out. It looks like Ashwinip 2013 in the chat has found it. I think you're a first-time viewer, so welcome. And yeah, really great move. Knight takes a4. Very nice, undermining the defense of this knight. So we're sacrificing, but we're also going to win this knight. We've removed the defender, and once it is captured, we not only have won the pawn, right? We've just traded knights and won the pawn, but we also take on b5, skewer the queen, and hit both rooks. So this is really a quite ridiculously powerful move. The computer actually, I didn't even notice it at first, but when the computer looked at this position, it said, yeah, it doesn't matter. White's going to move the queen somewhere. It doesn't matter where. And you don't even have to take one of these rooks because when one moves, you take the other one. So really, really nasty stuff here. Okay, but we've deviated a little off course from the game, so let's jump back. All of that is from this position, where I took here in the center, and we were saying c takes d5 is probably the best for my opponent, because it is not easy to find this b5 move, but it would be very, very nice. If they take with the e-pawn, I think things are a little simpler. I can still play very forcing by taking the bishop, and then playing this important move, bishop takes h3. Normally, I wouldn't want to open up this file for the rook, but in this case, it's well worth the compensation, because now I can play a simple move like knight to d7, and threaten to put the knight on c5, where we just saw it's a very powerful piece, but I've also opened up this discovery on the h4 pawn, and there's actually no good way to save this pawn. Even a move like queen e4 won't work. I can still play knight to c5, and all of these squares are covered, so you just cannot save the pawn. So I'm going to be winning this, and white's king once again is far more exposed than mine is. So that would be if e takes d5. So for those reasons, my opponent chose to take with the knight, but this actually leads to a problem as well. So if you have the black pieces here, take a look at this position and see what you can find as the best option for black. how would you continue with the black pieces here? And my recommendation is, even if it's a tactic or not, whenever you're trying to calculate a position and find the best moves, you always want to start with forcing moves. So any moves that are captures and checks, because generally they're going to force your opponent to respond, and they limit the number of variations you have to think about. So start with the forcing moves, see what you can find, and just see if you can find the best option for black to continue and gain a really nice advantage. All right, and once again, Luca6768 in the chat has found the nice idea that I found in the game. Knight takes d5, so we start with a trade that's going to force our opponent to respond with a capture, and by doing so, we also open up the line for this queen. Remember, f3, there is a weakness, right? This diagonal is weak, and now that my opponent has played knight to h3, they're actually blocking off the defender of the h-pawn, which, with all these forcing moves, gives me time to find the right answer. My opponent recaptures, and this is check. And now, the move I played is, I think, very strong and very natural. The computer actually likes a different variation, but it's very hard to understand why. So let me show you what I played in the game. The move I played here was queen to d4. I have, the bishop is attacked a lot. It's going to be hard to defend, and I'm up a pawn, so I am happy to, if my opponent moves the bishop, to just trade pieces. This would not be a problem for me. My pieces are much more activated, right? This knight is not really doing much compared to mine. My bishop can come out very soon and put more pressure if it needs to. So this is the move I played. The computer actually likes this kind of wild move. I'll just show you. Knight takes d3, which to me looks like I'm giving up this advantage. But the point is, after queen takes d3, bishop to f5, and there's a lot of threats. The queen has to move, and it's either going to let go of defending this square or this square, unless it goes to c3. If it goes to c3, then probably I can just continue by bringing one of my rooks to c8, putting it on this file, and just causing a lot of problems for my opponent. Any other move, I'm either going to bring my queen to d4, or I'm just going to take this pawn on c4, and I'm just kind of crushing through my opponent's defenses here. G4, G5 is also possible in the future. But yeah, the move I played was queen to d4, thinking I would just set up a semi-pin and put more pressure on this piece. And unfortunately here, my opponent made a blunder. In this position, my opponent played king to c2, trying to defend and maybe open up lines for the rooks. But unfortunately, I think this is too little too late. Perhaps better would be a move like knight to d2, defending. But after king to c2, black has a really beautiful way to continue. So see if you can find the best move here for black. Again, start with your forcing options. Those are going to be the most helpful when trying to calculate the right answer. Go ahead.
Right on D3.
DG. Oh, D3. Yeah, knight takes D3. Okay, queen takes. Okay, queen takes, king takes. You're close. So see if you can find it. So think again. This is the right first move. Knight takes D3. And you're forcing the queen to take if they don't want to lose the knight. So the queen's going to be on D3. What can you do now? Where? Yeah, so a few people in the chat have it. Yeah, several ones. And a first time RNG X Freeze, welcome. Yeah, the idea is very nice. We're forcing move by taking this piece, and once white recaptures, bishop to f5, pinning the queen to the king. This is a resignable position. My opponent is Mike Kummer and decided to try and force me to prove that I could win. So the game continued, but it's just kind of a matter of technique here. So I'll kind of quickly go through what happened. Queen takes, pawn takes, knight g5, king to g6, the knight retreats back, and I advance forward with the pawns, trying to break through. b3, opening up a little bit of a potential breathing room for the king, but unfortunately queen to d3, and I'm kind of creating my mating net here. So in this position, it is, I believe, mate in 3? Yep, mate in 3. See if you can find the best way to win in 3 moves here for black. Black to move and get checkmate in 3. What would you do? Okay, so a3 check. The king, you can go either to a1 or c1. So let's start with a1. Yeah, and it's actually the same either way. So start with here, and whichever way the king goes, queen to c3 check, hits both of these squares, and it's going to force king to b1. Defended by the pawn, we have checkmate. So this was the first game. And I don't feel bad about showing this because I'm about to show a game where Mike learns from his mistakes, and I don't learn from mine. In this follow-up game, which happened about 6 months later, so about a year later, I think the first one was November 2020, and this one was May 2021, we have the exact same opening position. Right, so we have the King's Indian defense, and my opponent plays the Saemisch variation with f3. We have bishop d3, queen d2, and I play my kind of pet line with knight to a6 and e5. But here, my opponent learns. So the last time, I don't know if he took a look at our game and analyzed or took a look at this position, but he stepped up a lot. So no longer was he autopiloting his moves, right? Last time, bishop h6 was played, which in the game worked out okay at first, but I did have this nice tactical idea that I missed. In this game, Mike played g4, immediately attacking the king side, right? So no longer is he autopiloting. This time he is now thinking, okay, the point of f3, the way he's choosing to play it, is to fight on the king side, and he's not wasting any time with that. And what did I do? Well, I continued with a5. This was the same move I played last time against bishop to h6, right? Again, my plan was the same. I'm going to stop you from advancing on the queen side. But you can already see I'm not paying attention to what's happening in this game. I'm playing my very normal King's Indian moves. Unfortunately, my opponent is not playing very normal King's Indian. He's playing the Saemisch variation. So I have to be responding to what he's doing. Instead, I choose to autopilot, and he's not worried about fighting on the queen side. So this pawn, if it's not a defensive piece, I can try and use it offensively, but I'm not really in a situation to do that yet. And I'm especially not able to do that faster than he is because he's already pushed these pawns. The other thing I want to notice is notice how he starts with g4. In the last time we played, he ended up playing h4 first, and we talked about that gave me a little opportunity, right? I had this outpost on h5 where I could kind of blockade with the pawn or the knight and cause him some problems. We looked at how the knight was a little better, right? If h4 and then h5, there's chances of knight to g3, where I'm hitting these two pieces and stopping him from castling. So he's learned quite a bit. I'm guessing he did do some studying because, yeah, this is quite a change. And a5, I have not done some studying. So this is the problem with autopiloting rather than just assessing what your opponent is playing. h4. And now, okay, now his pawns are really starting to come for me, and I'm not really sure what to do here, so I just continue with what I think is the best idea, and I play a4. Right? I'm thinking, oh, I'm just going to keep advancing this pawn, I'm going to threaten the queen side, and I'm going to fully stop him from attacking me over there. That's great, my plan is going so well. Well, a few problems. One, my opponent hasn't committed to castling queenside, right? Just like last time. And last time it caused him some problems, not castling too early. This time, well, I don't think he needs to, because I'm not really putting pressure on his king or on the center. If I'm playing good moves like c6, where I'm trying to break through the center, maybe eventually b5, like we saw that idea last time, then that might be something worth considering, is castling, trying to get safe. Maybe even getting your pieces developed and kingside castling. In some cases, maybe not. But I haven't given him a reason to do that yet, and his threats of advancing on the kingside are very, very significant. So instead of a4, I probably needed to play h5. And the computer says it's okay here. I think practically this is hard to defend still. Whether he pushes and just gains a lot of pressure this way, or whether he takes and opens up this file. Either way, I think, again, it's probably close to equal, white being a little better, but I do think practically this is a lot harder to defend. So h5 would have been maybe a better move, maybe even c6, but a4 is just not really continuing with any type of plan that's going to help me out. h5. Okay. Now it's become very obvious to everyone here that my plan of advancing the a-pawn is silly, right? It's just not helping my own strategy in any way, and it's giving my opponent time to really put pressure on my king. So at this point, with white's advance bearing down, I have to find something to do, and I start to crumble under the pressure. In this position, I played the move rook to e8, which is not good, right? For the same reason that a4 isn't good, this rook on e8 isn't actually doing anything. These pawns are very locked up. It is unlikely my opponent's going to try and break through with f4 anytime soon, so it's pretty unlikely that this rook is going to be able to do anything strong on this line. I would probably rather have it here on f8, where it's defending f7. Perhaps eventually I might try and play f6 or f5, just to create some counterplay over here. Maybe, force these pawns to trade somewhere they don't want to. But either way, I think it's more valuable here as a defensive resource than on e8, where it's trying to be aggressive, but just not really doing so. So again, rook to e8, not the best idea. Pawn takes pawn, and with the walls of my castle crumbling, I'm forced to respond, and I take back with the f-pawn here. I do think this is better than taking with the h-pawn. When you are under attack, you want to create as many barriers for your opponent as possible. So, yeah, Luca, I'll talk about that in a minute, because I am trying to create an escape plan, but I don't think rook to e8 was for exactly that purpose. But that does happen very soon. But I think taking with the h-pawn would probably have been worse, because now, if my opponent can set up some opportunity to trade, I wouldn't take, or I'm not saying this is the best variation. You can already see this is, actually, I think in this particular position, mate is unstoppable. Well, no, I guess I can play knight here and then run away here. So in this case, I would be able to escape, but still, not good, not ideal to just give up a knight like that for nothing. But the point is, after f takes, then that plan is not so good. My opponent actually plays bishop to h6, which is a mistake. This allows me to equalize the position, even though it looks very strong. The problem is I have this pawn here on h7, and so I have one more defensive resource between my opponent's rook and eventually their queen and my king. So keeping this as an extra, just something in the way, is usually going to be helpful on the defense, even if it's not perfect. But bishop h6, I want to talk about why this is a mistake, because it's very hard to see why, and even knowing the idea, it's not immediately obvious why. But there's actually a really nice defensive resource that black can use. In the game, I tried the move b5. I didn't see that I had something defensive to survive, and so I thought in desperation, I just need to create counterplay anywhere. Right? I know I'm just sacrificing a pawn, but I was hoping maybe if I can open up some lines, I can maybe get something involved on the queen side. I can maybe get my pieces to start fighting. I wasn't really sure, but I knew that I needed to get something away from the king side. So this was my thought. The actually really amazing defensive idea is to take the bishop and allow queen takes, and then to play this move rook e7, which is, again, defending the pawn here. I was worried. I didn't see rook e7. I was worried that this knight is the only defender of the pawn. Once g5 is advanced, I'm just going to be crushed. My knight's going to have to run, and checkmate is coming very soon. And I'm even here worried about ideas of like the knight coming in and attacking more. But actually the computer is okay defending this because knight to h3 is a little too slow. Queen to f8. And I'm actually just barely able to fight off white's attack. I do still think white is maybe slightly better, but somehow black is surviving here. If instead of knight to h3, then g5 is played, then the knight can just go to h5. And there's not really tricks of sacking. We're going to look at some sacrifice ideas later, but this is actually going to, be survivable enough for black. But instead, I didn't see that, and I played b5. So, trying to respond, and my opponent just continues very normally, very safely. Bishop takes, king takes, queen to h6 check, forced. And my idea, I moved king to f7. I think king to h8 is very obviously a bad move. Trapping my king here in the corner. This is going to be very soon checkmate. King to g8 is apparently about as good, but I think king to f8 is more natural, with the idea of, trying to run away somewhere, just escape all the madness that's happening over here. And here, again, I missed a really excellent defensive resource. G5 was played, and I thought in this position, there's really nothing to do. Because once this knight moves, if it doesn't move, it's getting taken. But wherever it moves, queen takes, h7 is coming, and my king, unfortunately, just doesn't have time to escape, because this pawn on d5 is really nicely guarding all of these potential escape squares. This is maybe showing also why earlier fighting with a move like c6 is really helpful. It can give my king maybe a little bit of a buffer zone to sneak through here and also try and fight back in the center. But after g5, the move I played was rook to h8. I kind of resigned myself that I'm losing this piece, and I just needed to stop the queen from breaking through. And after a move like takes, now I have a threat here on g7, so I played queen takes f6. But I want to give you all a shot at finding a better way to defend this position, kind of a miraculous way. I didn't believe it worked until I kind of looked through some computer lines, but I want to see what you can find as a really last resort effort that actually not only saves the game, but gives black something to fight for. So see if you can find a way to survive this devastating attack with the black pieces. What are your thoughts? Sorry, what was the idea?
H4, E5 to H4.
Uh,
E5 to H4.
E5 to H4.
Then
To H here?
yeah.
So knight H5. And someone in chat saw this too. Knight G8 does not work, but knight H5 does. And the idea here that I missed is I was thinking, well, this is silly. I'm just going to lose this pawn and everything is lost. What I missed is now the knight comes to G7, blocking the check. And it doesn't matter that this file is fully open. There's nothing left over there to attack. And amazingly, in this position, white just has no more way to attack my king. There's not enough resources available to go after this pawn. I can kind of defend against any of them. Yeah, somehow I am just surviving this position really miraculously. I think kind of a natural looking move here is, oops, if I can get it, rook in here to attack this pawn, but queen takes g5, right? This pawn is not defended. So this somehow just keeps me alive, amazingly. And there's also no idea of sacrificing the rook to take the knight. Normally, this is something you'll see in kind of beginner intermediate games. But somehow, even here, black has at least survivable chances. I do think the computer gives white a slight edge, but regardless, I will say on a practical level, this is very hard to defend as black, right? Your king is extremely exposed, there's a queen right there, this pawn is coming through, so technically this is survivable, but we're not computers, we're humans, so I don't know that I would still want to get in this position. That said, it would have been a lot better than what I ended up getting in, so we'll take that for what it's worth. So rook to h8, trying to hold on to h7. Pawn takes knight, obviously threatening check. So queen takes f6. And now there are ways to continue to press for an attack here, but my opponent just took a knight. So queen to h4, and my opponent is deciding if we can just simplify this position, trade a bunch of pieces, I will be very content. So for those who don't know, if you are more on the beginner side and just haven't heard, when you are down in material, generally you don't want to trade your pieces. Because what's going to happen is we can just imagine I go along with this trade, and so the queens go off the board, and let's just pretend we keep trading. The knights go off the board, the rooks go off the board, and everything is traded. Eventually you can see what happens is my opponent still has this extra piece left that I don't have, and all I have in exchange for it is I think I'm up a pawn somewhere. Yeah, I have 2 pawns over here. One of them is passed, but it's also a rook pawn. So that should be a pretty easy win for my opponent with that extra piece that I don't have. So when you are down in material, generally you don't want to trade. It's going to make it easier for your opponent when you have less resources. On the flip side, if you're up material, trading is a great thing. So I think this is a very good practical move for my opponent. And I decided not to accept. I play queen to g7, trying to hang on to the material. And so yeah, I declined the trade. My opponent now takes on b5, punishing that much earlier mistake, right? A long time ago, I played b5 as this desperation idea, hoping to give myself some counterplay. And after all of that, all of these forcing threats over here against my king, finally my opponent says, okay, well, I guess I'm just going to take this piece you gave me. And there were some minor inaccuracies that continued from here, but generally the game just went fairly straightforward. So I'm not going to spend too much more time on analysis. I will show you how Mike ended up winning this game. Bishop d7, I decided to give up this pawn so that I could develop my piece and maybe create some counterplay. Rook to c8. Perhaps it would have been a little better to play rook to b8 and maybe threaten something, and maybe eventually I can try and double these rooks, or sorry, just put them next on these files. But rook to c8. Knight to e6. A little bit strange, centralizing the knight, but I am able to trade. But again, my opponent is up a piece, so he's deciding, well, it's okay if I give a little bit of the material back, because I'm still up the piece. So in the end, it's still a little better for my opponent. Even though I get this pawn back, I'm still at a disadvantage because I've had to trade these pieces away. Rook to c1, h5, trying to keep my opponent from advancing in. Queen to f2, rook to b8, and again, these moves fairly simply continue. Opponent wants to trade again. This is a great move because I really don't have a way to save that bishop. c8 trade, and in this position, I ran out of time. But I am also down a full piece. So my opponent played extremely well and punished me and really learned from his mistakes, right? So if we go back and look at just the critical moments of these two games, what I want to emphasize is you want to be careful when you get to that stage. And I think last week I talked about finding your openings, and we talked about setup-based openings and sequence-based openings. One of the things you want to be careful of, regardless of what kind of opening you end up playing, is not to fall into this trap of autopiloting. You want to really respond to how your opponent is playing, right? Knight to a6 and to c5 is not something you see very often, especially in the Saemisch variation. So I would not be surprised at all for my opponent not to be ready for it and just to continue with normal ideas. As we saw, again, I didn't punish as hard. I was also autopiloting, but there are some really big issues with just playing on autopilot here that my opponent could have suffered from, and eventually does suffer from regardless, right? Because he's not really pressing in the exact right ways. if we contrast that with what happened in the later game, where again my opponent had the opportunity to think about what I'd done, analyze his own game, and come up with a better plan, we see that I'm the one who is still autopiloting, and my opponent instead is playing very, very precise, very strong moves that cause me a lot of problems. And obviously we're not computers, so neither of us played perfectly in either game. There were still chances for both sides, but my opponent played a lot better and really learned from his previous game's mistake. So if anything you learned from today, I would say is, one, analyzing your games is extremely helpful because it can help you see what you've done and how to change it. And you're not always going to be playing the same people, but I suspect a lot of you have friends either in person or online who you play with. And being able to kind of start recognizing their habits, what they play, especially their openings, and think about how you respond, it's a really good way to improve, right? Finding the best plans forward here, this versus this, is really a very strong way to continue. So yeah, that's kind of it. So thank you for tuning in, and I hope to see you again next week. But yeah, this has been Beginner Breakdown with Alex Moellering, and thanks.